This episode brought to you by MeepleRealty.com, your source for high-quality custom board game inserts. Meeple Realty, think inside the box. During the settlement phase, players welcome back returning survivors, advance their society, and prepare for the upcoming challenges. Every settlement phase follows these steps. Set up the settlement, survivors return, gain endeavors, update timeline, update death count, check milestones, develop, prepare departing survivors, special showdown, record and archive resources, and finally, end settlement phase. As we work our way through the settlement phase, it's important to keep in mind that if the game instructs players to select a survivor for any reason, this may be any survivor, including those that did not go out on the previous hunt, and even including those that don't have a name yet. If the game wants a specific type of survivor selected, such as returning survivors, then it will specify that type. To set up the settlement phase, first place the settlement board on the table. The settlement board is located on the reverse side of the hunt board. The settlement board is intended to guide players through the settlement phase, as each space corresponds with one of the 11 previously mentioned steps. Next, place the gear grids and record sheets of all returning survivors from the showdown on the table. Remember, a returning survivor is any survivor that survived the most recent showdown. And place the settlement record sheet on the table as well. The settlement record sheet contains all the information about a settlement and is double-sided. It will likely be updated multiple times throughout each settlement phase. Shuffle the settlement event deck and place it nearby the play area. Place any settlement locations the settlement has built in the play area below the settlement board. Place any innovations the settlement has innovated in the play area above the settlement board. Place any principles the settlement has chosen on the settlement board. Shuffle the settlement's unique innovation deck and place it face down in the appropriate spot. It should contain all innovations that are consequences of existing innovations in the player's settlement. Building and expanding the settlement's innovation deck will be explained in detail later in this video. Step 2 is Survivor's Return. As previously mentioned, all survivors that made it back to the settlement alive after the most recent showdown are considered returning survivors. Players erase any filled-in light or heavy injuries, and remove all tokens from the survivors. However, survival and insanity do not replenish, and their values persist until changed by gameplay. If the survivor had suffered any permanent injuries, these would not heal automatically, though players may find healing methods later in the game. If there are any effects specific to returning survivors, they would be applied at this point. These effects could come from principles, settlement events, and innovations. Keep in mind that if all survivors were killed in the previous showdown, then there are no returning survivors. Step 3 is gain endeavors. Endeavors are the generative energy returning survivors accumulate from their experience outside the colony. The settlement gains 1 endeavor for each returning survivor, so if there were 4 survivors that survived the showdown, 4 endeavors would be gained. And of course, if only 3 survivors returned, then only 3 endeavors are gained. Step 4 is to update the timeline. Players fill in the next lantern year to begin the new year. One of the most common confusions for players is the order in which a lantern year takes place. Often players believe the hunt and showdown phases occur first in a lantern year, and the settlement phase is the final phase in a lantern year. This confusion is most likely caused by the fact that the very first interaction players have when playing Kingdom Death Monster is a showdown phase with the White Lion, followed by a settlement phase. This can cause confusion down the road on certain timings of various events and showdowns, so it's important for players to keep in mind that the settlement phase is in fact the first phase of a lantern year, and it's then followed by a hunt phase and a showdown phase as the final phase of a lantern year. If it helps, players can think of that very initial showdown with the White Lion as year 0. Once the player is filled in the box next to the new lantern year, she draws the top card of the settlement event deck and performs its rules. The event card should be placed in the play area face up as a reminder of any persistent effects it may have during the settlement phase. Settlement events may have new ways to spend endeavors and unique opportunities to craft and impart lasting restrictions or bonuses. Let's take this example of the settlement event Acid Storm. Lingering effects, which are everything below this lingering effects banner, last throughout the settlement phase and can have positive or negative effects on survivors. If a settlement event provides endeavors, they will be indicated by this endeavor symbol. A survivor may spend an endeavor and any additional resources to participate in any activities listed. Often these endeavors will require the settlement to have a specific innovation before it can be used. For instance, to use Acid Storm Exercise, the settlement must also have Nightmare Training, or to use Acid Storm Distillation, the settlement must have Cooking. If a settlement event offers the ability to craft an item, the players must nominate a survivor to spend the listed resources and gain the listed effects. However, players should remember that they cannot take the crafting action until step 7 of the settlement phase. After resolving the random settlement event, players will now trigger any story events listed for the current Lantern Year on the timeline. In the case of Lantern Year 2, Endless Screams. If multiple events are listed, they should be resolved one at a time in the order listed. A Nemesis Encounter story event may be listed as an event, as it is in Lantern Year 4. We'll discuss Nemesis monsters in more detail shortly. It's also possible that through certain events or occurrences, specific settlement events may be added to the timeline during the campaign. To resolve that settlement event, the player draws that specific settlement event from the deck and resolves it in addition to whatever random settlement event was already played. However, the same settlement event may not be played more than once per settlement phase, so ignore any additional instances. Step 5 is to update the death count. If any survivors perish during the previous hunt, showdown, or during the preceding steps of the settlement phase, update the death count at this point on the settlement record sheet to reflect their deaths if you haven't already. So, perhaps someone died somewhere along the way, so now our population is 8. If a survivor dies later during the settlement phase, update the death count immediately. Step 6 is to check milestones. Milestone story events are conditional events that appear below the timeline here. Check the settlement record sheet to see if any milestones have been reached. The available milestones are first child is born, first time death count is updated, population reaches 15, settlement has 5 innovations, and population reaches 0. For each achieved milestone, check off its box and trigger the corresponding story event. If more than one have been achieved, they may be resolved in any order. If a milestone is reached after this point in the settlement phase, resolve it immediately. Step 7 is the develop step. During the develop step of the settlement phase, players will decide as a group how to spend the settlement's resources, including any brought back from the most recent showdown. Players can endeavor, innovate, and craft gear with their resources. Survivors can spend endeavors to innovate, build new settlement locations, or perform unique activities in the settlement. Anytime the player sees this symbol preceding an innovation, settlement location, or settlement event, it indicates that any listed rules or effects cost an endeavor to perform. First, the players must select a survivor to perform the endeavor, reduce the settlement's total endeavors by 1, and then follow the rules for the action the endeavor was spent on. Unless otherwise stated, any of the resulting effects apply only to the selected survivor. For instance, players could decide to innovate, in which case they would need to spend 1 endeavor, as well as 1 bone, 1 organ, and 1 hide. Once they did that, and they would follow the rules listed here to innovate a new innovation. Players could also spend an endeavor to build one of these 3 locations using the Lantern Horde as well. When a location is built, reduce the total number of endeavors by 1, place that settlement location in the play area, and add the new location to your settlement record sheet. The new location is a permanent addition to your settlement. Players may spend resources to craft weapons, armor, and items at locations their settlement has built. The resource cost for each item is listed next to that item. When a player spends resources to craft gear, she archives the resources and retrieves the crafted gear item from the box. It is up to the players to decide whether or not they pool their resources and craft gear as a group or split their resources and craft gear as individuals. Step 8 is the Prepare Departing Survivors step. In the Prepare Departing Survivors step, players need to decide if they plan to press on to the next hunt or end their play session. Even though the settlement phase is the beginning of a new lantern year, this is generally the easiest place in the game to end a session. If players decide to end their session, then they'll pick up exactly where they left off and start their next game. If, on the other hand, players continue, they must choose 4 departing survivors. If the population is less than 4, then they choose as many survivors as they can, and if they have less than 4 players, then one player will need to control more than one survivor. Set up each departing survivor's gear grids. Remember that they may use gear previously used by returning survivors as well as any gear currently in the settlement storage. Update armor points and attribute modifiers based on the equipped gear. Players should also be sure to apply bonuses from innovations, endeavors, or events that affect departing survivors. Step 9 is a special showdown step. If there are any special showdowns listed in the current lantern year on the settlement record sheet, then players will resolve those special showdowns immediately upon reaching this step. If there are multiple special showdowns, then players will resolve them in order. And now listen to me very carefully. Remember this. Never forget this. Special showdowns are not the same as Nemesis showdowns. A Nemesis showdown is not a special showdown when it's listed as a Nemesis showdown on the settlement record sheet. A special showdown will very clearly state that it is a special showdown. Reading through the forums on Board Game Geek, this is probably one of the most common mistakes, and it's even a mistake that I made initially when I started playing the game. Nemesis showdowns, as listed on the settlement record sheet, are not special showdowns. After a special showdown, whether win or lose, return to the update death count step on the current lantern year. Do not go to any step prior to update death count. Heal survivors and remove their tokens, but they are not returning survivors. Do not repeat any preceding settlement phase steps. Step 10 is to record and archive resources. Players record unspent resources in the settlement storage and archive the corresponding card. This is a very important step to ensure that the full range of possible resources are available in each deck and ready to be drawn. Resources in storage can be spent at any time during the settlement phase, and when one is spent, it is simply erased from settlement storage to reflect this. The 11th and final step is the end settlement phase step. At the end of the settlement phase, players must lose any unspent endeavors. No endeavors are carried over to the next settlement phase. Players store settlement innovations, principles, and masteries together, and also store the innovation deck in its current form. Make sure any unused gear is recorded in the proper location and stored back in the box. This gear will be available again in the next settlement phase. Finish cleaning up the play area by returning the settlement's locations, event cards, and unused survivor record sheets to the game box. Now let's discuss innovations in a bit more detail. First, let's take a look at exactly what players can expect to find on an innovation card. At the top of the card, players will find the name of the innovation, in this case, language and drums. Directly beneath the name are keywords for that innovation. So language has the keywords starting innovation, and drums are music and a language consequence. Some innovations, like language, will have persistent benefits. In this case, the survival limit is increased by 1. Also, it states that all survivors gain the encouraged survival action. Others, such as drums, will allow players to endeavor at these innovations for potential gain. You can see the endeavor symbol there. Endeavors may be spent on innovations in the manner previously discussed for endeavors. Certain innovations will direct players to add further innovations to the innovation deck. So, with language, you add all the language consequences to the innovation deck, and with drums, the players would add drum consequences to the innovation deck. The innovation deck is a persistent deck that grows during the campaign. It represents all the potential cultural and technological growth of the settlement. For instance, when players developed language, they were instructed to add the language consequences to the innovation deck. One of those language consequences is drums, which means that drums were one possible cultural and technological advancement that players and their survivors would be able to develop as a result of learning language. Whenever the settlement gains a new innovation, search the innovation cards for any innovations that are a consequence of that new innovation. So for instance, with the language innovation, these 6 cards are the language innovation consequences. These consequences are shuffled into the existing innovation deck. The innovation deck is persistent. Make sure to preserve the unique combination of cards in your deck between play sessions. If you're playing multiple campaigns, it might be wise to record on the settlement sheet which cards currently make up the innovation deck. The starting innovation deck is made up entirely of consequences from the very first innovation, language, which is gained from the first day settlement event. It consists of these 6 innovations that I mentioned earlier, each of which are marked language consequence. When an innovation is added to the settlement, players place it in the play area with all the other innovations that have already been gained, and update the settlement record sheet innovation list. Some innovations change the settlement's survival limit. You can see here, Hovel increases the survival limit by 1. When these are innovated, increase the survival limit on the settlement record sheet by the indicated number. If these innovations are lost, decrease the survival limit as appropriate. An increase or decrease of the survival limit is immediately reflected in a survivor's ability to store survival. However, keep in mind that an increase in survival limit does not automatically mean that survivor also gains 1 survival. Only their ability to store survival is increased. Weapon masteries are a type of innovation that are permanently added to the list of settlement innovations. When any survivor attains a weapon mastery, that mastery imparts benefits to everyone in the settlement. All other survivors now automatically gain specialist bonus for that weapon type and may use this in addition to whatever weapon proficiencies they have earned. Just to be clear, mastery of a weapon by 1 survivor grants specialization to all other survivors, which is the lesser form of mastery. Principles are the guiding philosophies of a settlement. They have 2 components, a story event and a principle card. Let's take a look at the principle of new life. The Milestones story event, when the first child is born, indicates that the principle of new life event should take place. When a principle story event is triggered, it will prompt the settlement to make a choice. Follow the rules of the event and then record the settlement's choice on the record sheet. Then add that principal's card to the play area. The principal's card will describe any persistent effects as a result of that principle. Players should be sure to apply any benefits of their principle as survivors are born, when they die, and at any other appropriate times. Let's talk a little bit more about settlement locations. The majority of a settlement's resources are spent at settlement locations. Initially, the only location available to survivors is the Lantern Hoard. Additional locations are added to the settlement through current locations as well as through story events. Let's take a closer look at exactly what settlement locations consist of. At the top of the location, players will find the name, in this case, Organ Grinder. Underneath the artwork of the location, players will find any gear which can be crafted at this location. Some settlement locations have unique activities that can only be found at that specific location. In this case, the augury. Most activities at settlement locations require an endeavor to be spent, which you can see with the endeavor symbol right there. Some settlement locations allow survivors to build additional settlement locations by spending a combination of resources and endeavors. The organ grinder allows players to build the stone circle at the cost of an endeavor, 3 organs, and 1 hide. Some settlement locations allow players to gain specific innovations by spending a combination of resources and endeavors. In this case, with the weapons crafter, a special innovate of scrap melting costs 2 scrap, 5 bone, 5 organ, and of course, 1 endeavor. The costs, as you see here, will be listed on the location, allowing it to be innovated. These innovations may be gained even if they are not currently in the settlement's innovation deck. Players should keep in mind, though, that a lock symbol, such as you see here, indicates that the gear or activity in question has a prerequisite. It is not available to players until that prerequisite is completed. In this case, the prerequisite for building the Monster Tooth Necklace is the innovation of heat. If the current Lantern Year has a Nemesis encounter, as Lantern Year 4 does, departing survivors will face off with the Nemesis, which is waiting for them just on the outskirts of their settlement. Players will complete the settlement phases normal first, but then departing survivors will skip the hunt phase and instead consult the story event for the Nemesis monster to set up the showdown. There are a few different ways Nemesis encounters may be listed on the timeline. If an event on the timeline ever simply said Nemesis Encounter, players would select a Nemesis monster of the player's choice from the Nemesis monsters list on the settlement record sheet. The player must select a monster level they had not previously faced. If it instead simply said Nemesis Encounter and then indicated a level, the player must select a Nemesis monster of their choice from the Nemesis monster list, but must fight the specified level even if they've faced that level before. If the encounter states Nemesis Encounter and then the name of a monster, players must fight this specific monster and also must choose a monster level they had not previously faced. And finally, the other way that it may show up is Nemesis Encounter, the name of the monster, and then an indicated level. In this case, the players must face the named monster of the specific level listed even if they have already previously faced that level. After a Nemesis monster and level are chosen, the players fill in the corresponding box on the settlement record sheet if it is currently unfilled. So if this was the first time the players were going to fight the Butcher at level 1, they'd fill in that box. And that's everything you need to know in order to complete the settlement phase of Kingdom Death Monster. Now let's talk a bit about the hunt phase of Kingdom Death Monster. During the hunt phase, players will choose a quarry, set up the hunt board, and hunt the quarry along the hunt board until the showdown begins or the hunt fails. Place the hunt board on the table. Remember, the hunt board is the opposite side of the settlement board. Also, place the gear grids and record sheets of the departing survivors nearby. Before departing, the survivors should have already chosen one of the available quarry to hunt from the quarry list, in this case, the White Lion. Players also should choose what level of the quarry they are hunting. The higher the level, the more difficult the monster will be to hunt. Players should keep in mind that the difficulty ramps up very quickly in Kingdom Death Monster, so they should choose levels 2 or 3 only after very carefully considering that option and the potential consequences. The hunt represents the survivor's journey to find their quarry. Survivors travel along the hunt board, facing perils along the way. The hunt board has 13 spaces, including the start space, overwhelming darkness, and starvation. There are 2 types of hunt event cards in the game, basic and monster. Basic hunt event cards are all the same and represent events survivors may encounter out in the darkness during any hunt. Monster event cards, on the other hand, describe events that occur while tracking that specific monster. Each monster story event has a diagram of the hunt board, showing exactly where to place monster hunt events and the monster based on its level. Players first shuffle the monster's hunt event cards and then place one monster hunt event on each space indicated by the letter E in the monster hunt board diagram. Next, place one basic hunt event on each empty space remaining. The only spaces that will not have a card on them once the players are done is Start, Overwhelming Darkness, and Starvation down at the end of the board. Third, place any hunt event cards on the hunt board triggered by gear in your gear grid. For instance, Bone Pickaxe states that after hunt phase setup, place the Mineral Gathering event on any hunt space. And so players could take this special hunt event card, Mineral Gathering, and place it anywhere they wish along the hunt board. Finally, players place the monster miniature on the appropriate space on the hunt board based on the monster's level. A level 1 white lion goes on this space. And finally, add the departing survivors to the start space. Mineral Gathering, which I previously mentioned, and Herb Gathering are story events that may be triggered during the hunt by adding their unique hunt event cards to the hunt board. If survivors have the appropriate tools in their gear grid, they can add Mineral Gathering and or Herb Gathering hunt event cards to any space other than Start, Overwhelming Darkness, and Starvation. These events must be added to the hunt board before survivors begin traversing it. Each event may only be added to the hunt board once per hunt phase on top of any existing hunt event cards. Regardless of how many of the appropriate gear players are carrying, each event may only be added to the hunt board once per hunt phase on top of any existing hunt event cards. Now it's time for the survivors to begin hunting their quarry. Survivors take turns as the event revealer. The event revealer draws the top event card of a survivor's current space. Reads it out loud to the other players and follows the rules on the card. Once the event is resolved, the card is archived and the next survivor becomes the event revealer. One thing I'd like to point out is that even though I only move the event revealer into the current space, in reality, all survivors are there. I've just chosen to do it this way to keep it clear who the event revealer is for each space. Anytime the survivors find that no card remains in the space they are in, the survivors move one space toward the monster, and the event revealer draws the top card now on that space. Hunt event cards are always revealed one at a time and resolved from top to bottom. The way I currently have this board laid out, there's only one card in each space. However, certain events throughout the game may require players to stack more than one card in each space. It's very important that they're always resolved from top to bottom. And unless otherwise instructed, the survivors must resolve all hunt events in their currently occupied space before moving to the next space. The monster will never move on the hunt board unless specifically told to do so by an event. If the survivors ever move into a hunt space with no hunt event card, the survivor who is the event revealer will roll once on the hunt event table before the survivors move on to the next space. We'll discuss rolling on the hunt event table a little bit more in just a minute. The first time survivors ever land on Overwhelming Darkness each hunt, trigger the Overwhelming Darkness story event instead of rolling on the hunt event table. If survivors manage to move into the same space as the quarry, the hunt phase is immediately over and the showdown phase begins. Players do not resolve any hunt events occupied by the monster unless that event is starvation. As previously mentioned, every basic hunt event card is identical, and each of them directs the event revealer to roll on the hunt event table to determine what happens next. There are 100 possible events on the hunt event table. The hunt event table is found from page 90 of the 1.5 rulebook to page 105. The event revealer rolls a D100 to randomly determine this event. In Kingdom Death Monster, a D100 is 2 D10s, with one nominated to be the 10s and one nominated to be the 1s. In this case, 68 was rolled. It's important to note that the results are between 1 and 100, which means 2 Lantern 10s is 100, not 00. Often, hunt events will require players to roll on a table to determine the outcome of an event. Each event will specify who should roll. It may be the revealer, a random survivor, or survivors meeting certain criteria. However, if no survivor is listed or indicated as to who should roll, then the event revealer rolls by default. The event revealer is also responsible for making any randomized choices using dice, names in a hat, or any other method. Some events may have requirements for a survivor to participate, such as certain level of courage or understanding, or some other requirement such as that. Be sure to read an event carefully to make sure any participating survivors meet any listed requirements. The first time in a hunt the survivors move onto Overwhelming Darkness, as has been previously mentioned, they trigger the Overwhelming Darkness story event. It's important to note, though, that Overwhelming Darkness cannot be skipped. If the survivors move through the space for any reason, rather than stopping directly on it, they still must trigger the Overwhelming Darkness story event. And if for any reason the survivors end up on Overwhelming Darkness more than once during a hunt, treat Overwhelming Darkness as a blank space after the first time. If a player gains gear during the hunt phase, she may add it to her gear grid. If the gear grid is full, then that player must either archive the acquired gear or archive another piece of gear from the grid to make room for the new gear. It's important to remember that cursed gear may not be archived in this way. Also, as usual, the gear grid may not be rearranged during the hunt phase, and the item cannot be added to another survivor's gear grid either. All damage suffered during the hunt is considered event damage unless otherwise noted. Event damage is always non-lethal. Event damage will still reduce armor points and insanity, cause light injuries, and even heavy injuries. However, event damage will not cause severe injuries or brain trauma. Keep in mind, though, that any damage accrued during the hunt persists into the showdown. So even though event damage is never lethal, it can still really set you back a bit. Any tokens gained on the hunt remain through the aftermath of the following showdown or the beginning of the next settlement phase, whichever comes first. There are special cases where survivors may suffer severe injuries or brain traumas during the hunt. These cases will be clearly indicated on the event causing it. Apply any attribute modifiers, impairments, and restrictions from these injuries and brain traumas suffered on the hunt to the showdown that follows. This includes any bleed tokens. If the player is ever told to skip the next hunt, it does not apply to the hunt the player is currently on. If a survivor retires or dies during the hunt phase, all of their gear, except gear with the irreplaceable rule of course, returns to the settlement storage unless the event states otherwise. It may not be used by the survivors still remaining on the hunt. If the monster moves into the survivor's hunt board space, then the survivors have been ambushed. End any current events and start the showdown immediately. When survivors are ambushed, they must skip their first turn, which in most cases means the monster will take 2 turns in a row to start the showdown. However, occasionally the survivors will get to ambush the monster due to certain events. When a monster is ambushed, the survivors may choose to go first in the showdown. Players do not follow the normal setup rules for terrain on the monster's story event, and instead players place the listed terrain, monster, and survivors on the showdown board anywhere the players decide. It's important to note, however, that setup rules on the terrain cards themselves still must be followed. Certain hunt events and other effects may move the survivors along the hunt board. When this happens, move the indicated number of spaces, but never ever move past the start space or past the starvation space. The same goes for events that move the monster. If players fight the monster on the starvation space, the hunt has taken too long to bring food back home. Apply the rules on the starvation space of the hunt board. These same starvation rules are also applied if all survivors perish on the hunt. This means the hunt has failed and the quarry is lost. In that case, the current lantern year ends and a new settlement phase begins. If the settlement ever innovates pictographs, survivors may attempt to flee a hunt. After any hunt event is resolved, players may nominate any number of survivors and trigger the runaway story event. Each nominated survivor then rolls individually on the event. And that's everything you need to know to complete the hunt phase of Kingdom Death Monster, which means with all 5 of our videos, you now have everything you need to play Kingdom Death Monster. I hope you've enjoyed this series. I hope you enjoyed this particular video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you like my channel, please subscribe. If you have questions, leave them in the comment section of the video where you have the questions, and I'll be happy to answer them as quickly as I can. Sometimes it might take a few days. Find me on Twitter, @BoardOffline. Purchase t-shirts over at geekygoodies.com. You can support me on PodPledge if you want to. But most of all, until next time, if you're bored online, board offline.